Well, good day everybody, this is Joe Van Cleve. In the last couple days, since around New Year's Day, I've been tinkering with a project. I've been making a 5x7 format Lumen box camera using a binocular lens. I've used one of these two lenses for years. I think the first camera application was in my speed graphic, and then I made a foam core 5x7, maybe 5x8 format camera that I used it for a while. I decided to make a dedicated camera for this project because I had a bellows, an experimental bellows that I had made years ago. This bellows has been around for about a decade. It's been stored in my garage and in the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter, and it still works fine. So I cobbled together some crude frames of wooden pieces to make it into a kind of a monorail camera, and then yesterday I hastily put together a crude kind of a film back, just sort of inserts into the camera. It doesn't really need to be as light tight as a true camera that uses paper negatives or film, because this is strictly for the Lumen process. It's very crude. It's not really in a finished state. I'm going to have to do some refinements to it. Anyways, it's all kind of a hokey setup, and that's kind of like what I like building, is these kind of homemade cameras. But let's cut to the initial videos I shot about building this project, and then we'll look at the results. Let me start off by showing you, first of all, you've seen this in other videos. This is the Lumen box. This is Jorge Otero's cardboard and paper box camera that shoots paper negatives to make Lumen print images, and it has a little plastic lens that is running at about f4.5, I think it is. For a long time I've had a couple lenses that I was wanting to work on to making a box camera. I've been interested in Lumen print photography. I've decided to use this Lumen camera box as kind of a model for how I'm going to make a slightly larger format version. Well, some time ago, on the order of maybe almost 10 years ago, I was experimenting with making homemade bellows. And what I did is I had a large sheet. It was something like 24 by 30 inches, heavy black craft paper that I got from the craft store. And I took a ballpoint pen and I scored a pattern, a bellows pattern. So essentially these lines of all four sides. And then I cut out the pattern and I folded this heavy paper along those score lines, and then I taped all of those edges inside and out with black gaffer's tape. This is roughly 3/4 inch wide black gaffer's tape. And so what I made for myself was an experimental camera bellows that's a single layer. Instead of using several layers of fabric with stiffeners in between, it's single layer. It is stiff paper, and then all the folds band with this black cloth gaffer's tape. But it's not exactly, I would say, weatherproof, because you still have some black paper exposed, and it's not really waterproof. But this camera, or this bellows, is approximately 5x7 inch opening, and it's been sitting around for a decade or more out in the garage here in the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter, and it's held up fine, and this tape is great. This gaffer's tape stuff, what kind of miracle adhesive they use, I don't know, but it works great. But anyway, so I've decided I'm going to use this for my Lumen box camera. The lens I referred to earlier, is a binocular lens. This is I think it was a Bushnell 7x50 binocular, and so the element is 50 millimeter diameter, 150 millimeter focal length, so it's approximately f3 wide open. And so this was one of these binoculars where the entire front element just unscrews. I noticed a lot of the newer binoculars are built differently, with some kind of a rubberized coating on the binoculars where it's hard to get to the front element. They won't just unthread. But what I've done here is I've cut the hole saw in a piece of this 1/8 inch aircraft plywood, and then because the hole saw size is not exactly the same, I had to sand it down with a little drum sander thingamajiggy on my drill press, and then it got too loose, and so I've put some gaffer's tape on those threads so that you can kind of screw it into the wood and make it hold. My intention is to make a little view camera style, kind of a rail camera, a monorail style camera here, and let me show you how that's going to work. Well, I was noticing when I was studying the way this bellows works is when the front flange or the end of the bellows sits kind of flat, you have these two flaps. There's a flap here and a flap up here with little pockets in here. And I was thinking if you have a thin enough sheet of plywood that's cut to just the right size, that it would sit in that pocket right there. And what you could do is simply gaffer tape the front flaps to the wood. Gaffer's tape being the universal tape for making cameras, right? So yeah, you could tape it all around, and then to attach it to some kind of a monorail, I'm going to have this piece of 2.5-inch wide oak. It's going to be my monorail down here, and I have a little U-shaped frame of wood that's going to bolt into this front plywood and bolt down to the front. And then the back of the camera, I'm working on a similar kind of an idea. I won't be using sheet film holders. I don't have 5x7 sheet film holders. This isn't really sized exactly for sheet film holders. So I'm going to make it a one-shot box camera. You load the camera with a piece of photo paper in the darkroom or a changing bag, and then you take it out and set it up and expose it. So even though this is a bellows camera with a kind of a monorail support system, I'm not going to have any movements. And so this is kind of the general idea of the front of it, this U-shaped piece of wood. What I'm going to have, I believe, is I'm going to have 4 machine screws sticking out from behind the wood panel to attach it. So what you're basically doing is essentially clamping the U-shaped piece of wood against the front standard and trapping the lip of the bellows between the two parts of the wood, between the upright and the plate. That's after you've already taped it, of course. And then at the bottom here, this U-shaped frame is going to be screwed into the oak monorail here. And it will provide a little bit of sideways motion if I wanted to, but I don't plan on really using any movements with this camera. And I'm tapping some 1024 holes in this thin piece of plywood so I can make some studs for securing that U-shaped frame to the front of it. Okay, so on the front of the camera, I have the holes drilled and tapped for the front lens board, also drilled and tapped in the U-bracket, and it's going to be ready pretty much to put the hardware in and secure it. I'm going to actually put the screws in from the front and put the nuts in from the back, just so the bolts won't stick out. And I really still need to drill the hole in the base to mount to the front of the monorail, which is going to be right here. And for the back of the camera, I have a wooden frame that is currently being glued up. This gives me a free open image area of approximately 5x7. It's actually like 6 3/4 by 4 3/4. The paper will be on the inside, and this will have an insert you stick over it. So today being New Year's Day, my favorite hobby shop is closed. That's the hobby shop that will actually have the model aircraft plywood. So since they're closed, I had to go to Hobby Lobby, and I bought some 1/8-inch basswood sheets for the back flange, but it's not plywood, so it's single laminations, and of course it's brittle, and it's already split on me once. I've had to re-glue it. But this is how that back frame fits into the back bellows, and it just slips into the folds like a little pocket on the top and bottom lip. I'm going to be taping it all around with black gaffer's tape to make it light tight between the frame and the bellows. And then, of course, attached to the front of that, I will have the frame itself for inserting the paper and having a back lid on it to keep it secure. Okay, so I have the front standard U-frame tapped. I have a 1024 bolt and a nylock nut tapped into the bottom of the rail. So I'm ready to screw on the front lens board onto that, and then the back is being glued. This rectangular frame is being glued onto the flange that has the piece of thin plywood with a window opening cut in it. So it's all being glued and it's being clamped, and it's going to dry hopefully okay. And now I am starting to use this 2-inch gaffer's tape, and I'm putting it behind the last fold of the bellows and wrapping it around the frame to enclose it and make it light tight and finish securing it. So I got this corner, so I'm going to just fold the gaffer's tape over and on itself. Okay, those are the left and right sides now. Taped. Yeah, their corners look a little crude, but that's just the way they fold. And I'll do the top one next. The bottom one I might just do around either side of this bracket. Okay, so the rear frame is all taped onto the bellows with gaffer's tape. This block back here is going to be clamped to the monorail temporarily. I think I'm going to make another, I'm going to get another block like this identical size piece of oak here, and I'll probably put a machine screw through this one with some thumb screws, and that'll be the way of clamping it permanently after it's adjusted. But next I'm going to attach the front standard to the front lens board. Well, okay, this is about all the progress I'm going to make this evening. I've been working on this most of the day. So here's the front standard. It is screwed in place. The lens is in place. I have not installed an f-stop on it. I'm going to do that inside of the camera later on. I'll be putting the aperture stop recessed behind the lens the way they do it in the Holgas. And I'm going to try to do a big enough aperture stop so I have around f5 or faster, because the Lumen process requires a fairly fast aperture. Okay, so the back of the camera here, first of all, the insert. So this insert frame is 5x7. A little bit bigger, so you have plenty of room to stick a print in there, 5x7 paper. And then this is 5/8 deep, so I'm going to have a plate that fits on here flush with the outside, and it's going to have a recess, or an extension I should say, probably some layers that extend in here and pushes the paper tightly against this front flange, this lip. And then, of course, with everything painted black, the light trap is basically, the light has to go sideways, bounce this way, and come in order to leak. So it'll be, I think, pretty good. Okay, so I'm just using a piece of typing paper inserted here in the back, just to show you there is an image, even in the dim lighting in the evening here in my workshop. But there is the upside-down image, and that is the binocular lens working all the way open at about f3. Okay, so for the initial test of this camera, I have it set up in the backyard. It's about 10:30 in the morning. I have this little sunny face decoration on my back wall. The back wall always catches the sun because it's facing to the south. I have these trees in the neighbor's backyard. And so I've composed onto the ground glass, ground plastic. Here's my composition, focused on the sunny face. And I have a little bit of rear, not tilt, but lateral swing this way, and on the front standard a little bit that way. And the reason why is because the wall is going this way, which I'd like to be the plane of focus, and the camera is kind of going this way. So I'm using a little bit of horizontal Scheimpflug rule, and as you can see, my rear standard clamping method is still pretty primitive. It's just a couple clamps. I have this clamp set here so that the standard can't come any further back, and this clamp kind of sets the angle, and it gives me enough room to pull out the ground glass and load my paper negative, which is 5x7 format, into the camera, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to put the lens cap on here in the front. Alright, so this was all hastily conceived. So I wetted the paper and then I squeegeed off the back side, and because I didn't want to get the black foam core and all the other paper parts wet inside the camera. But by the time I got it out here, even in the shade, and loaded it in there, I could already see the front side of the paper where the water was already starting to turn color with streaks from the water. So I don't know if this is going to be a dead shot or not. We'll have to find out here. But anyways, I have my exposure going, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to leave it for about half an hour maybe. Okay, I have a second test exposure going on right here, and I've pre-wetted the paper. I wiped off the back side and then I squeegeed the front side so there's no standing liquid, but the emulsion is still tacky. It's absorbed liquid or water. I don't know if that actually is going to give the same effect as having it soaking wet or not. We'll have to find out. But anyways, there it is. And this time I used a plastic film envelope to move the paper and the back of the camera out to where the camera has been pre-focused at. So it's going to sit there. I'm going to give it another half an hour exposure just to be consistent with the other shot that I took, and we'll see what we get. Okay, so here was the first image out of the camera, and this was with the paper wetted. It was sort of mottled with standing water. Part of it was dripping off. That's what this modeling is from. And then the second image, it was squeegeed dry after it was wetted. Not dry, so the standing liquid was squeegeed off, but the emulsion was still damp. And so the colors are very similar. They're both 30-minute exposure. I'm going to go ahead and rephotograph these and get some positives processed. Well, I thought the results were pretty good, considering they were the first trial run of the camera. Obviously, I have some issues in terms of figuring out how to transport the paper from like my dark room out to the camera if it's in my backyard or somewhere like that. Or a little more challenging would be inside of a black envelope directly into the camera, especially if you want to pre-wet the paper. So I'm going to have to work on some little Tupperware box of water and kind of how to work this out in the field, if you will, which I've never really done with the little small Lumen box camera either. But working with a larger film format makes it a little more challenging. But the initial first results are promising. I've always enjoyed the optical low quality look of this binocular lens. I've always thought it looked pretty good. Sharp along the middle of the picture, softer around the edge. I do have the lens stopped down to about f5, which is a 30 millimeter aperture, and it's a 50 millimeter sized lens wide open. 150 millimeter focal length, of course. Okay, so some improvements or things that I'm going to be considering changing on the camera. Well, I think I need a lens cap only because when I'm loading and unloading the wet paper in the back of the camera, I might not want to be exposing it at the same time. So I just made this little black foam core gaffer's tape little thingy that just sticks on the front and kind of like that. And in the back of the camera, obviously there's some changes that'll need to happen. Obviously, one of the most glaring problems is going to be relating to clamping the back of the film holder, the standard rigid or fixed to the monorail. As I indicated earlier several times, I'm using just hardware store clamps right now. It works okay, it just doesn't look very good. So obviously aesthetics, if that's important, I'll have to make some kind of a clamping system, but it works for now. The other thing I was thinking about is in relation to getting a little bit sharper image on this with this lens without stopping it down any further. As you might remember on the little paper Lumen box camera from Jorge Otero, he uses a curved film plane. The paper is curved slightly inside the camera, kind of like that. And he has some little ridges along the inside of the camera that holds it in place, and the stiffness of the photo paper keeps it in place. Well, I thought about doing that with this camera. Of course, this is 5x7, the opening right here with a little bit of a flange for the paper to sit against. So the actual image area is somewhere around 4.5 by 6.5 inches. But in order to make a curved film plane, if I want to focus the center of the image so it's focused onto this flange here, which, by the way, I'm doing with a piece of Lexan plastic, clear Lexan plastic, that I've taken one side and sanded it with a random orbital sander, about 400 grit roughly, and just inserting that into here, and that's my focusing screen. But if with a curved film plane, what I was thinking about, and I sort of built a prototype, these are little paper holders, and they're going to be attached to the inside of the wooden back that seals up the camera. They'll be taped to it, and they would be short enough to fit inside the camera itself into the bellows, like that, which gives it an image height of about just under 4.5 inches. But this little holder would hold the paper in the curve part. It would hold the edge of the paper. So this is giving it a 2-inch curve from the center of the film plane up to the edge. I don't really have a piece of photo paper to show you, but it would be like that. I have another of the brackets like this, and I have a little drawing here that illustrates it basically. So I made these little paper pieces to hold the photo paper in there as an alternative way of doing it, but my clearance is so tight against the opening that it doesn't really go in very easily. So I'm going to have to probably make a whole nother film back. I think I'm going to make it with black foam core board and just with everything built on this little holder. So if I want to do a curved film plane to get a little bit more sharpness on the edges, I'll do that. But anyways, this is Joe Van Cleve, and this is how I build a little homemade cameras. I just tinker with them and improve them and go wild with building stuff like this, and it's really a lot of fun if you got yourself a little bit of spare time. But in any event, I hope this whole process, this project, gave you some inspiration to tinker with Lumen cameras. You don't need a dark room at all. No processing of paper, just photo paper. Cut it in a dim room, dim lighting, cut it to shape, stick it in your camera, go out, expose it, and then photograph or scan it, Photoshop it into a positive image. It's a great process. I encourage you. And until next time, you guys have yourselves a great day.